Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we explode the many modern myths of the mainstream narrative and where we correct some of the common misconceptions in our education caused by the relentless propaganda that we're exposed to. Hi there, I'm your host Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to be looking at some of those misconceptions in our education around the issues of finance, wealth creation and indeed our freedom. Joining me to discuss this is Jeff Berwick, whom I was fortunate enough to catch up with very briefly just a couple of days ago during his brief visit to London. Jeff created the Dollar Vigilante website and is the editor-in-chief of the newsletter, an excellent source of financial education I might add, and also his Anarchast YouTube channel, as well as the Anarchapulco annual gathering of anarcho-capitalists in Acapulco, Mexico. Fantastic interview, packed full of really useful information. I do hope you enjoy it. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For those of you unfamiliar with my use of the Matrix metaphor, perhaps I'll just say a few words of introduction. The metaphor obviously based on the film The Matrix that came out in 1999, Keanu Reeves starring in the Wachowski brothers film. And the film depicts a dystopian future where most of humanity are enslaved effectively by machines, where their heat and electrical energy is harvested by the machines, and they're existing in a sort of a virtual dream world, if you like. And one of the themes of the film is the hero Neo, who teams up with some rebels who offer him a choice to bust out of the Matrix. So he's offered the red pill, blue pill choice, and the blue pill representing falling back asleep, waking up, believing whatever you like, and the red pill representing the desire to know, effectively the desire to bust out of the Matrix, the sort of precursor of all knowledge, if you like, that wanting to know the truth. So this is the basis of the metaphor. And when I speak about the Matrix in the real world, we're talking pretty much of the sort of mainstream default philosophy that people tend to pick up on. In the absence of any thinking, in the absence of any questioning, it's the sort of the general default sort of package deal of beliefs, convictions and assumptions that we naturally pick up on in the absence of doing any independent critical thinking. And this is why the whole essence of this show and the Living Outside the Matrix is essentially thinking our way out of the box. It's, if you like, self-educating ourselves out of the Matrix. So in this context, Jeff, you're a wonderful example of somebody who's living outside of the Matrix. You're clearly somebody who's a rational man. You've done a lot of thinking. You're successful financially, and your lifestyle in Mexico, enviable to a lot of people. So maybe you can start us off by way of sort of introduction of how did you sort of break out? What is it that triggered your process of questioning and rejecting everything that you were sort of told in the mainstream?
Well, it's interesting you say that I'm outside the Matrix. More and more every week I realize I'm still in the Matrix to some extent. There's still things that I realize, I totally just took that for granted, that what they said on the news was correct. So this is sort of like an ongoing process of sort of waking up to what's really going on. But I guess the first time that it really hit me was it was right after my internet company, which was worth a few $100 million in the 90s. After the tech bubble collapsed, it went to almost zero. And I soon found out about the book The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin after that. And it essentially describes how the Federal Reserve was founded, what central banking is. And after I read that book, I was like, why don't they tell anyone? This whole system is basically a scam. The entire monetary system is essentially a scam, right down when you get down to it. And so I finished reading that book, and I was like, wow, it's one of those things, it's like, I had no idea. They don't teach you any of this in the school. It's not on the television programming. It's not on CNBC. And soon after that, it was right around that time, because 9/11 had happened already. But I, back then, I'm ashamed to say, I accepted what they said on the news. I was like, oh, I guess it was guys in Afghanistan in a cave who did it.
Yeah, likewise.
And I actually remember being at a baseball game in Toronto, and taking my hat off for the national anthem after 9/11 because I felt so patriotic and we're under attack and all this. But it was quite quickly after that I found out about how central banking worked, and then I saw I guess you could call it documentary or a video called Loose Change about 9/11, which was partly done by a person named Luke Rudowski of We Are Change, who ended up becoming a good friend of mine afterwards. But I met him, actually I watched Loose Change. So I'm sitting there, I think it was around 2003, 2004, so it was a few years for me to catch on to what was going on. Sure. And as I watched that, my mind blew. I was like, what? It wasn't what they said it was? And pretty much from that point forward, I just spent every minute on YouTube looking up everything. And I'd look into, well, what really happened in the Vietnam War? Oh, the Gulf of Tonkin was a false flag attack. What? Look back, World War II, what actually happened there? Oh, they actually cut off Japan's oil supply on purpose. They knew they were going to attack Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. That's how they wanted to get into the war. Once again, not what we were told it was. World War I, a whole other story. Basically everything, I just looked.
It snowballs, doesn't it? One thing leads to another. And
totally. Until you get to the point where I am now, where I don't accept anything that's told to me by anyone as truth or fact. I essentially will take that information and go, okay, well, let's actually look into that. But what I found is almost everything we're told, the schooling system, that's actually in indoctrination camps, basically everything in college. You don't learn anything of value in college. It's actually just basically indoctrinating you even more, even in economics and stuff like that. They teach you totally statist economics. The medical system, how I'm from Canada and so many people are like, oh, we're so proud of our socialized communistic style medical system where it takes you months to get a doctor's appointment. But even that whole system is set up to make people sick and keep them sick. Yeah. So it's just more and more and more that I've essentially been taking the red pill now for well over 10 years. And like I said, I'm still going. Every week I find out about something. I'm like, oh, that wasn't what they said it was.
It's interesting you say that we're still in the matrix because it's not an in or out situation, as you rightly pointed out there. It's a process. It's a process of educating ourselves. And it is shocking, isn't it, to find the extent to which we're lied to. The extent to which you cannot accept any particular piece of information as true without some sort of personal investigation into it to verify it or not. So in terms of your financial education, what kick-started that? You were obviously in business, as you mentioned, prior to this sort of realization of all the disinformation, and you've mentioned that you didn't get a financial education in school. I like many of my friends also sort of had no guidance whatsoever. I've spent 25 years working as an employee, sort of safely insulated from economic reality. So what was it that started you off on the path of your investments and your business career?
Well, basically, when I was younger, I figured that in order to get women and in order to have a good life, you're supposed to make a lot of money. And that's kind of true, actually, when it comes to the women part of it. So that was basically all I thought. I was, just younger and I wanted women, so I'm going to make money. I turned out I'm fairly entrepreneurial minded, so I started a number of companies that did really well. So I was in that path just basically for that reason, and I've since found out that most of that stuff's kind of a lie too. You don't end up all happy when you've got lots of money and lots of women. That's actually not the road to happiness. In fact, that led me down a path to depression and near suicidal tendencies because I got to the point where I had all the money and all the girls, and I was completely unhappy. And so that was another lie told to us by the cult or the culture of the television programming, that's what you should be trying to do. Yeah. But because of that, I had started quite young in my 20s with an interest in the financial sector, especially the stock market. The stock market to me, oh wow, this is great. You can, especially where I was from in a place called Vancouver, Canada. That was home to what they called the Wild West Stock Exchange of the world. It was known for its scams and its frauds and Bre-X and all these sort of things. But it also bootstrapped a lot of companies that became quite big. So a lot of entrepreneurial ventures would go there. They'd raise a few $100,000, even sometimes a few $1 million. Some of them would turn out to be really big companies. Some of them would be just total disasters. Right. But something about that really I liked. I liked the fact that I was like free market wheeling and dealing. So I initially got into stocks. So that was actually my first internet company. It was called stockhouse.com. It's still the top financial website in Canada. It expanded to about 8 countries worldwide. We had hundreds of employees before the tech bubble collapsed. So that was my first entry. And then once I found out afterwards why it all collapsed, I decided I needed to start something called the Dollar Vigilante and talk about how these central banks work, what's going to happen, how this is all going to collapse, the fiat currency system's all a lie. Everything's a lie. Basically, just start there. Everything that you think that they say on television, it's all lies. Yeah. So I've just been going down that path. I got into Austrian economics, which is a way of looking at economics, which is a free market perspective. Mm-hmm. And it essentially says, yeah, these central banks, there's no good purpose for it. In fact, it's a tenet of communism, central banking, and essentially it's a way to enrich the point. It's not even the 1%. They even lie about that. It's the 0.00001% at the expense of everyone else in the world through the theft of inflation and through the manipulation of interest rates. Two things that are illegal or not allowed for us to do: counterfeit money or manipulate markets. That's all the central bank does. Yeah. So I got into all this stuff, and because of my background, I just started the Dollar Vigilante, and went really well. And the most interesting part about it all was I was saying this whole system's going to collapse, and I started the Dollar Vigilante in 2010. And a lot of people asked me, well, what's going to take its place afterwards? And I said, I don't know, but I'm sure the market will come up with something. And I found out about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies 1 year later in 2011, and I became one of the biggest promoters of it. I said this could change the world when Bitcoin was at $3, and so it's been quite a roller coaster ride for me.
It sounds it. I mean, well, you preempted one of my questions, which is when you started the Dollar Vigilante in 2010. What I was going to ask you, whether that was due to the fact that you anticipated the collapse of the dollar. These fiat currencies, yes, as we know, that they all revert to their intrinsic value of zero ultimately, and it's sort of mathematical inevitability. Mm-hmm. So do you still hold that, along with many other commentators, that the collapse of the dollar is inevitable?
That was the reason I started the Dollar Vigilante. So the tagline from day one was surviving and prospering during and after the dollar collapse. And I said when we started in 2010, I said I expect by the end of this decade, so by 2020, that all these fiat currencies will collapse. We're still a year and a half away. I think we're pretty on track for it. It's going to be right around now, right around the next couple of years. Yeah. I could go a little longer. Really trying to figure out an exact date is really tough. And
no one has a crystal ball. Right?
No, not at all. But we essentially with where the dollar is going and all that, essentially it's in collapse already. Mm-hmm. That's why many of the things that we're into, like precious metals, gold was $200 in 2000. It's now $1,600. Yeah. Bitcoin was $3 when I started promoting it. It's now into the thousands and thousands of dollars. So a lot of people say, "Oh, you guys are all gloom and doomers, and you're just waiting, and you just hold up in your underground bunkers waiting for a collapse." No, we're actually profiting from what we see going on. Indeed. Right now.
They should visit the Dollar Vigilante to see exactly that.
Yeah.
So in the context has changed, hasn't it? Because since 2009 and the Satoshi White Paper, the previous collapse of 2008, the whole context has changed, because now there's a sort of a viable alternative, or there's an alternative on the pitch. So how do you see all this, the collapse playing out in the context of the crypto sphere, the emerging Bitcoin having established itself slightly, these new altcoins and so forth? Do you see some sort of many people think that the cryptocurrency is going to benefit a lot from the collapse of the dollar? It seems inevitable. What's your view on that?
Yeah, they absolutely could. The most interesting thing to me is that Bitcoin actually came out at the height of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And it came out with a very stated thing that this is going to be the next money after this whole system collapses. Yeah. And that's essentially the case. Now, this is the biggest question everyone always asks. How's it going to play out? When's going to be the one day where everything collapses? It's probably not going to be just one day. It's going to be something big's going to happen. Probably the bond market's going to have some serious issue. It's been in a bubble now for about 40 years. The stock market's overinflated bubble. One of these things is going to start to come off the rails at some point. And plus, all the central banks are printing so much money now that at some point we're going to get pretty close to hyperinflation in one of these currencies, whether it be the yen, the euro, the dollar. Could be all of them at the same time. And these things don't just happen in a couple of days. It happens over months and sometimes a couple of years. So I don't think
with the hyperinflation issue, a lot of people think that because we don't see any of the results of hyperinflation, we don't actually see prices going up like they do in Zimbabwe or like they have done. What do you think is behind that sort of concealment of the inflation?
Well, I don't understand where people say that prices aren't rising. We're in London right now. I just showed up. I'm in a 300 square foot room. It's about $1,000 a night. Eating a salad at a restaurant here in London's like $80. You want to send your kids to school, which is a complete waste of time, and you're just going to get them into massive amounts of debt and waste 4 years of their life. But if you do in the US, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars now. What's a flat cost in London or New York? We're talking millions, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking parts of $1 billion for an apartment, for a penthouse suite. So we're already seeing the prices rise. And what we haven't seen so much is the smaller things rise as much, but they're definitely rising. You just have to go back 10 or 20 years and just look at the cost of almost anything, and you can just see it's gone up a lot.
I guess what offsets it to some extent is the tech stuff coming down in price, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That can sort of confuse the picture to the consumer.
This has been the biggest boon for the central bankers and the controllers and the powers that be is that if we had not had this massive technological advancement in the last 20, 30 years with the internet, and everything just sort of stayed the same from about 30 years ago, we'd already be well into hyperinflation. It's that the cost of everything was brought down so much by innovation. Yeah. So we're not live streaming this right now, but we could be. From a little tiny little thing that costs a few $100, the internet connection is basically almost free, really, when you think about it. We could be beaming this to millions of people across the world. To do that in the old days, you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Now it's a few $100. So this is one thing that gets lost in translation with a lot of people. They say, well, why is some things quite cheap? It's because the market is so good. There's still enough of a free market out there that it brings the price down of everything. You got a laptop there. That's a laptop like this, a MacBook Pro, 20 years ago, of course, it didn't even exist. But if you've got anything even close to that kind of quality, you'd be talking thousands and thousands of dollars. And now it's like $700 or $900 and stuff like that. So the market always brings prices down and always improves the life of everyone in general, as a whole. But at the same time, the central banks are
free
always
market as opposed to the centrally planned market.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm talking about the free market, absolutely. And there's still enough of it around. It gets taxed, it gets regulated. You can imagine what a beautiful life we'd have if we didn't have the central banks, if we didn't have the taxation, the regulation, the governments. Everyone would be so rich. But they're constantly stealing from people through the taxes, through the regulations. They're destroying the economy, through the inflation of the money supply. Most people don't see that. For example, I believe the U.S. Coins used to be made of silver back in the 60s and things like that. I forget exactly when they stopped making them out of silver. But essentially, for the price of a silver 25-cent coin, you could get a gallon of gas in the 1970s or 60s. So for a quarter, you could get a gallon of gas. You can still, for that same quarter, because of the silver content, still get actually more than you can get 4 gallons of gas today. So the actual value of things, the prices have risen a lot, but the money has gone down in value so much, and people just don't see that as much. And of course, it's really about the bread and circuses. As long as everyone has just enough that they can turn on and watch the footy game, and they can afford a couple beers, your average person isn't going to wake up and go, hey, there's something kind of wrong with this system.
There's too many distractions.
Absolutely, and they do that on purpose.
So in terms of the financial education that people need, there are a number of things, obviously, to do with the economic reality that we haven't got time to discuss now, sort of the escalating debt and the everything bubble and all this sort of thing. But what would you suggest to the would-be self-educator, would-be financial self-educator, in terms of diversifying our investments within fiat currency land and without precious metals, cryptocurrencies, shares, stocks, bonds? Not exactly asking you for financial advice, but a sort of broad outlook. What do you think people need to know in terms of diversifying their investments?
Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at most Americans today, and people here in the UK, and actually most places in the world, most people are living still paycheck by paycheck. They should all be quite well off, but because of all the things we just talked about, they're not. So it's interesting, most people watching this video actually have no assets. If you have $25 and no debt, you have more assets and net worth than I think 75% of Americans right now, because of all the debt. And this whole system's based on debt, and that's what it does. It gets everyone into debt, whether it be student loan debt or car leases or mortgages. Mortgage is French for death contract. It's on purpose. So for most people out there, unfortunately, and I'm very sorry to say that they just don't have a lot of assets. But for those who still have some assets, and it's not too many, like really, you've seen the middle class get totally hollowed out in the U.S. The U.S. used to be the place that had the biggest middle class, and because of that, it was quite prosperous. There was lots of people who were making decent enough money that can go on a vacation once or twice a year. They could buy a car with cash sometimes. They didn't need all these loans. That's been hollowed out. We're really seeing like the top 0.1% becoming incredibly rich, because this actually, all these things that they do actually benefit the incredibly rich, because they can invest in things that don't go down because of inflation and things like that. Whereas your average person is just working from paycheck, and every paycheck, they don't see it. This is the real evil part about it. It's just a little bit less and a little bit less. Yeah. So most people don't have too many assets. If you do have some assets, if you're in things like the stock market or mutual funds or bonds, sell immediately, sell yesterday. I can't explain how this is so close to coming down, a lot of this stuff. And this stuff will go to zero, a lot of these things. Bonds, a lot of them are just going to go to zero. Everything's so over indebted, there's no way of paying back any of these amounts of money. The U.S. government has $21 trillion worth of debt now. It was only about 10 years ago, it was under $10 trillion. So it's basically doubled in the last 10 years, which is banana republic levels. And if interest rates were allowed to rise, and eventually they will have to rise, the market will force it up at some point, it will make the U.S. government bankrupt, which will mean the U.S. Treasury bonds will all be worthless, which will mean, well, I don't even know how many treasury bonds are out there. Well, there's at least 21 trillion of them. $21 trillion will just evaporate overnight. You can imagine what that will do to economies. We've seen in the past when a country like Argentina can't pay for its bonds, it almost causes a worldwide recession, because it's just a few $100 billion just disappears overnight. It just causes all kinds of problems. When this stuff goes down, it's going to take a lot of stuff with it. So the real things to get into...
It's like a house of cards, isn't it?
It's a complete house of cards.
Domino effect.
Absolutely, and it's going to happen. It's a mathematical certainty. It will happen. It's just a matter of when. And we're not talking decades. So we're talking years or months or weeks. That's what we're talking about here. So it's better to be a year too early than a day too late. And that's what we've been doing since 2010. We've been making a lot of money investing in these things, because these things are going to do well in the meantime until the collapse. So invest in things that central bankers can't counterfeit. So any hard assets, so precious metals, gold, silver, real estate, not as much in places like London or New York where they're highly overinflated, but places like Mexico, it's incredibly cheap right now. All kinds of places in Latin America and Asia. At least those things will still exist as we go through this collapse.
Sure, yeah.
And then of course there's the cryptocurrencies. Now of course they're fairly new and they're very volatile. So if you're a 80-year-old woman on a pension, but you've got $50,000 sitting in a pension fund, don't put it all into Bitcoin or something, because it's fairly new and very volatile. But we recommend 10, 15, up to 20% for some people into the cryptos. A lot of the rest in the hard assets like precious metals and real estate.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's there's a lot of talk around the cryptocurrencies. I hear this all the time. The sort of doubt as to whether or not the internet will even remain standing, which fundamentally challenges their confidence in cryptocurrencies. Yeah. And we've got this sort of dip in the prices. We're currently going through this sort of buy opportunity that many people talk about, and a lot of people in conversations I have are incredulous as to how the price can remain so low in the face of so much good news, because we hear so many news reports of various institutional money about to flood in, and so many little tiny pieces of positive news that all build the case, and yet the slump continues, and this obviously is challenging for many people's confidence in cryptocurrencies. Do you think this is that we'll soon come out of this? Or again, you have no crystal ball, of course.
Well, it's so funny, because a year ago, let's say just a year and a half ago, Bitcoin was around $400. It's now around, just check the day, whatever day we put this live, but it's around $6,000 right now. Ethereum was around $10. It's now $500. So the fact that some people are getting discouraged, they obviously got in sort of at the wrong time there. And I was saying that a lot. I was saying, be very careful. Once we got over about Bitcoin 10,000, especially once we got to Bitcoin 20,000, I said, there's going to be a pullback here. There needs to be a pullback. Yeah.
That's kind of historically we can see that's a
natural part of
the growth cycle. Would you say?
It's natural. Yeah, you can't go from $300 to $300,000 without it coming down a little bit
Yeah.
first. It's just the
So
natural
this is
way
a part of
markets work.
people's financial education, isn't it? They need to be aware of these cycles as
Absolutely.
the general trend. If it's increasing, there are still going to be these corrections.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could see it still go down still. We've picked a bottom that's potential bottom. It might not get there of 3,000 to 5,000 for Bitcoin. And I actually said to, and so did my partner at the Dollar Vigilante at Bugos, we were recommending to our subscribers to take some profits when Bitcoin is around $20,000. All of them to December, January, we're take profits, take profits. I personally took a lot of profits. I'm just starting to buy back now. But I'm waiting, I'm actually hoping that we have a bit more of a crash. I'd like to see like a panic crash,
Yeah.
really get out all the weak hands, and just the people who really know what's going on, again, have most of the cryptos, and then it can rise again. But it could rise from here. Now the big question is, if we have this major financial collapse, let's say it happens later this year in the fall, it's possible cryptos can go down in the meantime, because then you have a liquidity crisis.
Yeah.
What happens in a liquidity crisis is the stock market starts collapsing. It's down 50% in 4 days. That can totally happen. A lot of the bonds, a lot of the governments around the world start saying we can't even pay this back, or we're going to print up so much money that everyone just doesn't want it anymore. When those sort of things happen, you see a lot of people panic. It's basically a panic sell, and a lot of liquidity. So a lot of people are like, well, I've got my lease and my mortgage, but my stock account's down 50%, my bond account just disappeared completely. What's left that's of any value? Oh, my cryptos are still doing pretty good. I'll sell those. So that's why those could go down during a panic. And I'm actually saving a certain amount of my capital. If we have that very panic sort of situation, that's when I'll just buy as much as I humanly possibly can. But at the same time, enough people are starting to wake up to what's going on that we could see the cryptos skyrocket in that situation, because if people start realizing, wait, the stock market's basically crashing. Most of the banks have just shut down because they were so over leveraged, they're all bankrupt. So the banks all close in like the US or something. You could see Bitcoin go $30,000, $50,000 in that situation. The weird thing, the funny thing will be is that a lot of people won't be able to, because they won't be able to even get access to their money, which isn't really money, that was in a bank that they thought was theirs. So we're going to have some incredibly interesting times ahead, and there's no sure way how to play it. It's basically hedging some bets and being careful.
And it does all point to the importance of people financially educating themselves now. And getting to grips with all this, working out what their strategy is, as you mentioned there, with things like cryptos going up and down, really important to take profits, to look carefully at the ups and downs and not buy in at the wrong time and sell out and get all hopeless when it's right at the bottom.
Yeah.
So there's
that's not the way to do it.
That's not the way to do it. Indeed. So another dimension then of you, Jeff. Obviously, you're an anarchist as well, and this anarcho-capitalist, in fact. So, what is it that drove you in your education, your self-education, to the realization that anarchism really is the way forward? A system where anarcho-capitalism, a system where our property rights are respected. It's really a key ingredient of freedom, isn't it? And this is where the cryptocurrencies obviously play in, because there's no central bank, there's no third party. The cryptocurrencies, one of the reasons I love them is they absolutely support our freedom.
Absolutely.
So what was your journey into anarchy and anarcho-capitalism?
Well, for people out there who don't know what that even means, anarchy just means it's a Greek word, and without archy rulers. So what I really believe is people shouldn't be slaves, because if you have a ruler, and we're just down the street from Buckingham Palace here right now, if you have a queen or a king or a president, and they say they own you and that you owe them a certain amount of money that you didn't agree to, you're a slave. So I'm against slavery, and a lot of people go, oh, anarchist, that's pretty crazy.
It's one of those things that's got a really bad rap, isn't it? In the Matrix, absolutely. The propaganda is that anarchy, troublemakers, people bombing, causing disruption.
Right.
It couldn't be further from the truth.
No, that's what, again, the mainstream media, the television programming, the government, they give you all this wrong information so that people get really scared. Oh my gosh, he's an anarchist. Maybe he's going to break a window. It's like, no, I'll buy you a drink. And that's why I also call myself an anarcho-capitalist, because a lot of people who call themselves anarchists are actually just communists. And, if you want to have communism that's not forced on someone, if you want to go somewhere with some friends and you have a piece of land and you all share everything, fine. But a lot of these people believe in forced communism, which is pretty much the only way to have large-scale communism in today's world with the way that human nature is. I don't want to be a communist, so if you want to do it, you're not an anarchist. You're basically saying, okay, we have a new government, it's a communist government.
Sure.
So a lot of people confuse anarchy with communism because of that. So that's where the word anarcho-capitalism came from. But then the word capitalism has also been destroyed.
Again, that's another one that
On
very few
purpose.
people understand. Capitalism. Capitalism is the word has been completely misrepresented.
Yeah, on purpose. They want people to think that what happens in the U.S., for example, with all these giant monopolies and international corporations, that's capitalism. It's not capitalism. Capitalism just generally means you have capital and you save and you invest in things, and it's a free market.
Sure.
That's the best thing for humanity. What you have in the U.S. today is called fascism. It's called crony capitalism. It's actually mixed with communism thanks to the central banks. So it's actually the worst of everything. So that's why I call myself those words. So basically, I just believe in freedom. And I believe no one should be enslaved. And I believe if you want to trade something, you want to trade that MacBook Pro for my Samsung Galaxy over there, we just do that trade.
Yeah.
And
It's voluntary, isn't it? The
Totally
key
voluntary.
distinction that I think that people need to get about capitalism is that it respects property rights for a start. It respects what's yours is yours, what's mine is what's mine. It respects the fact that we own our own lives fundamentally and the products of our efforts. But the key factor is a voluntary exchange, isn't it? As you said, you're a fan of freedom. I'm a fan of freedom. I call myself an anarcho-capitalist as well. I like the distinction you made there against the communist anarchists.
Right.
So it's absolutely crucial to remember that capitalism is the one socio-economic system which actually supports our freedom, doesn't it? Our choice to exchange voluntarily rather than in any sort of coercive system.
Right, true capitalism is good. And that's why the word voluntarist has become fairly popular, because we're trying to explain to people, I'm an anarchist. They're like, oh, you throw bombs and stuff. It's like, no. And then we'll say, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. They're like, oh, capitalism like in the US, that's terrible. It impoverishes people and everything. It's like, no, not that kind of capitalism. So it's actually come down to a lot of people just started using the word voluntarist, which they haven't managed to destroy yet. And it'll actually be pretty hard for them to destroy. It's like,
yes.
Those people think everything should be voluntary. It's like, ooh, they're scared.
That's a difficult one to corrupt.
So yeah, we're just starting a new word basically because of it. Because even the word liberal, that actually used to essentially mean anarchist. It used to be laissez-faire. You just don't bother anyone if they're not bothering you, that sort of thing. That's essentially what an anarchist is. But they've even turned the word liberal. That's now some weird thing where you believe in forced people being extorted and giving money to other people and all kinds of weird stuff.
And another one of those myths about capitalism is the idea that it's a zero-sum game economics, isn't it?
Yeah,
So if you prosper, then all these people over here have been exploited, which of course is not true. There may be exploitation going on,
Sure.
but it's not a fundamental cause of capitalism.
No, that's a lot of what they indoctrinate people into today. I mean, you go to college in the U.S., which please don't, complete waste of time. But if you go to economics class, you're learning basically communist type things, and they will say things like that it's a zero-sum game. So if I just made some money this week, I just bought this nice suit because I made some money, someone must have lost.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. I might have worked my butt off and built them something, and they
Offer
said
value,
this is
created
worth
product.
more than the time you put into it, so I had enough money to buy a suit. So yeah, they want people to believe that that's the case. And it actually works with a lot of younger people today. What's happened is a lot of the young people, they're born into hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt in the U.S. A baby born today has $250,000 worth of U.S. government debt it's supposed to pay off in its lifetime. Not possible.
through
obviously.
taxation.
Yeah, and then they even go to the school system, which kids are told they have to get a job, which is totally not true. Well, actually, in the U.S. it's kind of true because that's how locked down they've got it. But they go to the school system, and what used to be like they're learning Bachelor of Arts. What are you even going to use that for? But they'll spend like $100,000, and they'll go into more debt. That student loan debt is actually the only debt in the U.S. you're not allowed to expunge in a bankruptcy. So they will have that debt for the rest of their life until they can pay it off. And because of the way they've destroyed the economy, the way that they are constantly stealing from people through inflation and regulation and taxation, they'll never be able to catch up. And just this week, the U.S. announced that if you owe money on taxes, that they're going to revoke your passport. So it's now a debtor's prison. And what I think is going to happen They're going to say, well, the economy's horrible, I can't pay it back, we can't expunge the debt. They'll go, well, you're going to have to be enlisted in the military, and they're going to send them off to some place to destroy on behalf of the corporations and Israel and other sort of facets of things, and they're all going to get blown up, unfortunately. Like, sorry, but I didn't do it. I'm actually trying to tuck everyone out of it and wake people up to it.
Yeah.
So a lot of people try to kill the messenger, and that's what they'll say about me. Oh,
Sure.
don't listen to him, he's just all doom and gloom. In fact, we can have a much better world if enough people woke up right now and knew what we knew and just started using cryptocurrencies. A lot of these governments would implode, and there would be a certain period of sort of, a little chaotic. A lot of people would be, it would be definitely a period of uncomfortableness for a number of people, but very quickly the free market would just start to build because enough people would have enough capital still saved that they could rebuild. But what's going to happen, unless people wake up, is everyone's going to lose everything in this collapse, and it's going to be really bad for a lot of people, and they're going to do lots of wars to kind of blame it on the wars. Oh, it was the Russians, it was the Chinese. Go to Russia, go to China. Those people don't want to attack the U.S.
No,
it's all propaganda.
Yeah.
And so that's what they want to do. But if enough people wake up, we actually still have the control, the power in our own hands, that if enough people woke up right now, we could change this world almost overnight. We'll get rid of all these problems, but it's really going to be a wake-up process. And unfortunately, most people don't appear like they want to wake up until it's too late and they really get smacked.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to, rather than waking up, I think it's a process of deliberately choosing to educate ourselves. Obviously, waking up is a useful analogy there, but people really need to grasp the nettle that they need to educate their way out of all this confusion, all this disinformation, all these myths within what I refer to as the matrix. You alluded there to the Keynesian Austrian economics divide, the mainstream being largely Keynesian, of course, and Austrian being, you mentioned that you kind of discovered that in your self-education. So maybe, guys, you can pick up on that and take that as a key starting point, maybe, or key ingredient in our self-education.
Well, if there's two books I would recommend, if you want to learn about economics, there's a book called Economics in One Lesson. It's this big. I think it's for free. Henry Hazlitt.
Henry Hazlitt.
Yeah.
Or was it Harry? I don't know.
I think it's anyway. Hazlitt, someone, and you will learn everything you need to know about economics in that much. What they want you to think is you have to go to college for 4 years to learn about economics, which is a total lie. They'll just teach you all these mathematical formulas that mean nothing because they want to get everyone confused. And then when it comes to how the world would work without government, there's a great book written decades ago called The Market for Liberty. It's also about this big. So both books that would actually teach you pretty much everything you need to know about how the world could and should work and where we actually could be are almost brochures that you can read in an afternoon.
They'll be in the show notes, so that's great. Jeff, I'm aware of time, and just one more point here. The Anarchapulco gig, which you began a few years ago, fantastically successful. It's been really growing big style, hasn't it? I know a lot of people I talk to over here in Europe, particularly in the UK, lament the fact that it's all the way over there in Mexico. Any plans, do you think, in the future for some kind of gig like that in Europe? Have you had any conversations with people around that idea? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of people say that it's really hard to get all the way to Mexico from certain places in the world, and it is. But it's totally worth it. If you can anyway go, it's a real life change.
I've been wanting to go for the last 2 years and just couldn't quite make it happen.
Yeah, if you can't, I'm actually going to an event in 2 days in Porto, Portugal, called Anarcho Portugal, and it's actually not our event, but some other people have just said, we're going to take the idea, we're going to do it over here in Europe. We might do our own, just so you know, so I'm not involved with what they're doing, but I'm supportive of it. I'm actually going to go speak at it. But we might do our own sort of major event in Europe at some point. We're thinking maybe Greece or something, but that won't come until at least next year. We're still building the big one, which has become huge. We're expecting 3,000 to 5,000 people in 2019, and so we're just building the team out for that. But yeah, we could see that erupt all over the world, and like there's nothing keeping you from not doing it, right?
Sure.
So someone has done it this week in Portugal. So feel free, call yourself anarcho, whatever you want. I have no problem. I'd love to see the whole world have anarchist conference.
Lovely, excellent. Well, Jeff, any sort of closing statements, or how can people best contact you? Obviously, the dollarvigilante.com, the anarchast.com, the YouTube channel, the Anarchast. Fantastic source of information there with Jeff. Any other?
That's basically it. Dollar Vigilante on YouTube. If you want the newsletter, which we give a lot of it, advice price, so we were telling people to take profits at 20,000 on Bitcoin. We were just telling people to start buying now. So if you want to get that information, we're been the people covering that market before anyone else was even knew what it was. And that, in fact, a lot of people thought it was a scam back in 2011, 2012. Just subscribe to the newsletter, dollarvigilante.com/subscribe. As you mentioned, I've got my podcast called Anarchast, which is now over 400 episodes, interviewing anarcho-capitalists, anarchists, voluntarists all across the world, and then Anarchapulco, which is an amazing event. It's coming up February 14th to 17th in 2019 in Acapulco, Mexico.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jeff. Really appreciate that. I'm Nigel Howett of lawfulrebel.com, and if you're interested in getting some further information about how you can thrive and prosper outside the matrix, visit the website www.lawfulrebel.com. And thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.